So in today's video, we're going to be breaking down 5 of the most common misconceptions about ancient Egypt. My name is Luke Caverns. I'm an American explorer and an anthropologist, and like millions of other people, ancient Egypt has always captured my imagination. And because so many people have been so fascinated by ancient Egypt for thousands of years, it causes a lot of misconceptions or lies about ancient Egypt. So in today's video, I picked 5 of those common misconceptions or lies, and we're gonna break them down. I could probably make a dozen videos about misconceptions in ancient Egypt, and heck, maybe I will over time. But in today's video, I picked 5 of my favorites. And lie number 1 is that the pyramids were built by slaves. Now, this idea actually comes from Herodotus, who visited Egypt sometime in the early 5th century BC. He was a Greek traveler, author, and writer. And when he visited Egypt, he was told by Egyptians living there that the pyramids were built by slaves. We also have this account coming from the story of Exodus that was written probably sometime around 900 BC, so roughly 600 years or so after the Exodus would have taken place in Egypt. And these accounts tell us that slaves were responsible for building the pyramids, or if not building the pyramids, then all of the divine religious architecture, such as the temples that are scattered all throughout Egypt. But when it comes to the time of the pyramids, if we're going along the established traditional chronology of ancient Egypt, the main pyramids, the Great Pyramids, were built during the 4th dynasty in Egypt, somewhere between 2600 BC and about 2450 BC, roughly this 150-year time period. Now, during this time period, Egypt definitely did have slaves. You had prisoners who would be essentially forced into like chattel slavery. Think of bound slavery, like chains around your ankles and wrists, and they would be forced to work, probably not high-level stuff. And then you might have foreign slaves that were captured during war that were brought into Egypt and forced to do labor. But this really isn't high-level labor, and we know this because during the excavations of the Giza Plateau, we found all these mastaba tombs of high-ranking nobility, you could say, of people who were direct servants to the king or the pharaoh himself, such as the pharaoh's viziers or his doctors or his architects or the leader of his projects.
The pyramid was a national project.
And you can see how many people were working on the pharaoh's projects, and specifically the 3 pharaohs that we traditionally attribute to the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, such as Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura. We see all of their top advisors and people who were working during their lifetime buried around the pyramids, and we learn a lot about their lives by excavating their tombs. Also surrounding the Giza Plateau are these workers' graves, where archaeologists have gone in and they've excavated graves that are on this west side of the Nile in not a high-ranking tomb per se, but definitely a tomb that they would have been honored to be at the base of the pyramids and all of these grand, noble, semi-royal mastabas. Their lives are revered, their deaths are revered, they're given good burials, and when we carbon date these bodies, they are contemporaneous with the royals that are buried around the pyramids during the 4th dynasty, and specifically during the reigns of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura. So we have this massive group of people that we know were working on the pharaoh's projects during the 4th dynasty. So this idea that there were slaves building pyramids, one, they're so architecturally incredible. I mean, they're perfectly aligned to true north. They're perfectly level. The way that the blocks are fitted together and stacked and lifted, it's been a mystery for nearly 5,000 years now how this project was done. This was certainly not carried out by uneducated slaves or like a small percentage of project managers telling slaves what to do. So I want to talk about something that I think all of us do, but we don't really admit to, and that is the late night health spiral. It's 11 p.m. and there's something that's been bothering you for a few weeks, and instead of booking a doctor's appointment like a reasonable person, you spend the next hour or 3 on the internet convincing yourself of the worst case scenario. And the frustrating part is that the rational solution is obvious: book a doctor's appointment. But then the next morning comes around and the thought of having to call around at doctor's offices and sit on the phone for hours and hours, sitting on hold and then not even knowing if the doctor is going to be in your network, it just feels like this massive unnecessary barrier. So the appointments never get made, weeks go by, and the cycle repeats. And I got really tired of that cycle. For instance, I kid you not, just last week, I noticed that I had this little bump show up on my arm, and it got bigger over the course of a couple of days. And before I knew it, I was up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when I should have been sleeping for the next day or just planning a dermatology appointment. And I'm convincing myself of the worst case scenario. And this happens to me a handful of times a year where I just become such a hypochondriac. I'm losing sleep and I'm losing hours of my day just obsessing over whether or not something is wrong with me. But the problem is, it's not easy to find a doctor. It's not easy to book a doctor's appointment. And if you do book one, it could be 6 or 7 months down the road. In fact, that's what the doctor's office told me. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. And that's where today's sponsor, Zocdoc, genuinely changed how I approach this. Zocdoc is a free website where you can search for in-network doctors, filter by specialty, availability, and location, read verified patient reviews, and book an appointment instantly. No phone calls required. And what I appreciate most about Zocdoc is the transparency. You can see actual time slots, choose what works best for your schedule, and confirm your booking in just a few clicks. And most appointments happen within 24 to 72 hours, with same-day options available. And they cover over 150,000 providers across nearly every specialty: primary care, mental health, dermatology, dental care, and much, much more. What surprised me most about Zocdoc was that it actually works the way it's advertised, and it was quick. I was able to get into a dermatologist, and they told me that it's actually just an overactive scar that's forming a bump with these defined ridges, which made me feel much, much better. And I didn't have to wait weeks for the appointment. Zocdoc is the tool that finally removes all the excuses to not prioritize your health. And at no cost to you, there really isn't a reason to not try Zocdoc. So just to be real with you, I have a history with skin cancer problems. This is a scar from about 7 or 8 years ago. And so when I see things pop up, I've got to get on top of it. But again, booking doctor's appointments is way more strenuous and more difficult than it should ever possibly be. And skin cancer is not unlike so many other conditions where you really need to get on it as soon as you notice something from the very beginning, because when you notice things early, they're very treatable. If you push them off because it's hard to get a doctor's appointment, or you just want to ignore it thinking it'll go away, it gets worse. And sometimes it gets worse to the point that you can't fix it. So if you've got something that you know needs to get checked up, use Zocdoc. Head to Zocdoc.com/Luke Caverns, linked in the description below or on screen, to find and instantly book a top-rated in-network doctor today. I know it may seem small, but clicking the link in the description or on screen is a huge step towards prioritizing your health. Thank you to Zocdoc for sponsoring today's video and helping us all take better care of our health. What most likely happened here was that most people in ancient Egypt weren't running their own farms, right? There's this statistic that goes around that for every one farmer, he could produce enough grain to feed anywhere from 100 to 1,000 Egyptians in ancient Egypt. That's just how fertile that Nile Valley really was. So you had a lot of people who didn't need to be farming year-round, and hell, farming doesn't even really take place year-round. It does more so in Egypt, but you get what I'm saying. There was a lot of labor that wasn't used. And so think of the way we work today. About 3 months of our yearly income goes back to the government. Well, in ancient Egypt, they didn't have coins or dollars or digital currency, obviously, or anything like that. But what they did do was they would conscript you to work for, let's say, a quarter of the year on whatever the Pharaoh's project was. So once you had served that amount of time, that was your tax for the year. So you would have people working in cycles on these projects. Now you think that the average person just would be fairly uneducated or maybe dumb, but what's really interesting, and I've never seen anybody else point this out ever, but in the writings of Ptah-hotep, he actually talks about how the wisest, most intelligent words you would ever hear, or saying that the wisest and most intelligent people you might interact with were just the women that were working in the village. And what he's saying is that the average ancient Egyptian person was pretty intelligent and not entirely uneducated. So you had this capable workforce that was being conscripted to pay their tax to the pharaoh to work on his project, whatever he's got going on. It's probably not just the pyramids. It's definitely not just the pyramids. His palace, the temples across the river, down all the way down in Luxor, all the way down in Aswan. You would probably show up to Memphis, which is this political capital in Egypt, in northern Egypt. You would show up, you would say, I'm here for my next 90 days of conscription, tax service, and then they would delegate where you would go for the next 3 months to essentially pay your tax back to the state. So you might get sent up to Giza to work on pyramids. You might get sent down to Luxor to work on tombs or temples, or you might get sent down to Aswan to work on tombs or obelisks or something like that. But that's really how it worked. There probably were slaves that worked on lower level aspects of the pyramids, but this idea that the pyramids themselves were built entirely by slaves or mostly by slaves, there's just no evidence to support that at all. And lie number 2 is that the Egyptians were obsessed with death. The Egyptians are often called a death cult, but it's not death and dying that they were obsessed with. It was life itself and the best parts of life. If you travel through Egypt and you visit more than just the pyramids, if you go down to Luxor and Aswan, you get to go into the tombs of the nobles and things like that, you'll see all over the walls, it has nothing to do with death at all. It has everything to do with life after death, continuing life, continuing the best parts of life. Other than the pharaoh himself, who had this other divine destiny after he died, everybody else in Egypt who would be given an afterlife, their afterlife would actually be them reliving their life, returning back to this heavenly sort of Nile, but they would only be repeating the best parts of their life. So that's why ancient Egyptian tombs are so important, because it actually tells us what was important to the Egyptians themselves. So on their tombs, they'll have depictions of them on these reed boats, piking down the Nile and fishing and hanging out with their family and their dogs and going hunting and all of the things that Egyptians would have loved to do in their pastime. That's what they hope to do in the afterlife. So actually, Egyptians obsessed over the best parts of life and made a lot of preparations during their life so that their afterlife would be abundant and joyful and full of life. They kind of just skipped over the death part. They saw the death as a transition from one world to the other. I don't even know if they thought of death like death. I think that they just thought of it as moving from one plane of existence straight to the other, just a continuation of life itself. And this plays a lot into mummification, wanting to preserve life. They are constantly bringing offerings to the dead to sustain them in the afterlife. Everything in ancient Egypt is actually about life itself. And I can hardly think of any aspects of ancient Egypt that glorifies or obsesses over actual death, actual dying. I can't think of anything in Egypt that glorifies or obsesses over that. It's all about life. And the third lie is that the Egyptians worshipped cats. Now, this is a pretty funny one. You go to ancient Egypt, you see cats everywhere. People adore cats and take care of them and love them, as they have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. You see paintings and depictions in movies of cats sitting with pharaohs or sitting in ancient Egyptian temples being worshipped, statues of cats, mummified cats. Cats are everywhere in ancient Egypt. Everybody loves cats. But the reality is that Egyptians didn't actually worship cats. They didn't actually see a domestic house cat as being a god or something that needed to be worshipped. The confusion here actually comes from the goddess Bastet, who is often depicted as a cat or a lioness, and she represented protection, fertility, and the home itself. Cats were loved and always treated well because they stayed around people's houses and protected grain stores from rodents and serpents. And the Egyptians, of course, saw this as something that was sacred and divine and given to them by the gods. And killing a cat in ancient times was a serious offense because they were like a protected species. But that's still very far from worshiping a cat. Think of it as our bald eagle. Nobody worships the bald eagle, but you do hold the bald eagle in high esteem, and killing one is a serious offense. But it's not a serious offense because you killed something that was like a divine sacred, sacred to us, but not ethereally, spiritually sacred animal, if that makes sense. It's not a god. The Egyptians also revered crocodiles and jackals and birds and all kinds of other animals that lived in ancient Egypt, but that doesn't mean that they were gods. They were just kind of parts of a god. They were parts of this divine, sacred world around them that they revered, but it doesn't mean that they actually worshipped them. This is one of the things with studying ancient cultures is a lot of our interpretation of the world comes from the Greeks and the Romans, who really like to be categorical. They like to separate things and put them into cleanly defined boxes. When you study pre-Greco-Roman civilizations, or you study civilizations in the Americas, you kind of have to step outside your traditional way of thinking and realize that in some ways, you're kind of studying an alien culture that doesn't really see things or have the same categories as you do. Think about all of their categories actually being inverted and opposite of yours. They are different amalgamations of things that are categorized inversely to the way that you and I naturally perceive them, if that makes any kind of sense. And the fourth lie is that the Egyptians rode camels. Now, years ago, this blew my mind when I first learned this. How can you separate ancient Egypt and the camel? How can you separate the pyramids, the desert that sits beneath them, and the camels that are walking back and forth in the shadow of the pyramid? It's such a romantic and seemingly very ancient image that's just, how can you separate the two? But the reality is that camels were not actually brought into ancient Egypt until around 500 BC, just before the time of Herodotus visiting Egypt in the early 5th century BC from Greece. That's pretty recent. I mean, the pyramids had already been standing for around 2,000 years or more by the time camels arrived in ancient Egypt, which is insane. And another thing that's a strange side note is that horses themselves were not actually brought into Egypt until around 1,000 years before the camel was. So about 1500 BC, maybe we push that back to 1600 BC. But still, that's 1,000 years after the youngest date of when the pyramids were constructed. So we're talking about people who were probably mostly walking around ancient Egypt and transporting all of these great monuments either by ox and cattle or by manpower, but they weren't riding horses and pulling chariots. They weren't sitting on camels yet. And that's crazy. And come to think of it, all of the ancient Egyptian tombs I've gone into, some of them do have horses if they come from the New Kingdom period, sometime around 1500 BC or afterwards. Sometimes you do see horses. You definitely see chariots in tombs, like in the tomb of Tutankhamun. But you never, and I challenge some of you guys who go to visit ancient Egypt, or people who are coming on the Raiders tour with Johanna and I to Egypt, look around, look on the temple walls, look on the tomb walls when we visit them. Try to look for a camel. We see it as being so synonymous with ancient Egypt, but personally, I cannot think of an ancient Egyptian tomb that I've ever been in, and I've been in a lot of them, that's ever depicted a camel. And lie number 5, or common misconception, is that ancient Egyptian tombs were booby-trapped. Now, I believed this for the longest time. My entire childhood, I thought that the shafts that were leading off inside the Great Pyramid were like these tunnels that if a tomb robber went the wrong way, you would just fall down into some kind of abyss and just disappear into the darkness. And I thought about the tombs that were carved into the side of the mountains, and if you took the wrong turn, you could just fall into a hole, which actually does exist now that I think about it. But this idea that ancient Egyptian tombs inherently were just booby-trapped, and this was something that a lot of Egyptians did, just is false. I mean, that wasn't a thing. If they did booby-trap their tombs, they were by far the worst trap builders that humanity has ever seen, because almost no ancient Egyptian tomb went unplundered. Even the pharaohs themselves, most of their tombs were plundered. And this is not because they didn't build their tombs well or because they didn't hide them well. It's because the people who built the tombs were typically the people also coming back in the night and robbing the tombs. And the guards that were likely paid by the state itself to protect the tombs were also a part of looting and pillaging the tombs as well. Now, there actually is a tomb that does have what is sort of like a booby trap in the tomb of Seti. As you go down these stairs, you go down this long ramp down into the mountainside in the Valley of Kings. You walk forward a little bit, and then all of a sudden in front of you, there's this huge 50 to 100 foot drop where certainly tomb robbers who are coming in looking for the entrance, holding their candle in front of them, don't realize that there's this massive pit in front of them and they fall. But is that really meant to be a booby trap, or is it more of a defensive measure? Basically prompting the tomb robber with this problem in front of them. Are you going to try to cross this massive abyss? Are you going to go through the labor of building a huge bridge to cross this massive abyss, of which you can't even see the end of, to try to find what's at the end of this tomb and rob it? Or are you just going to go somewhere else? I think it was more of a defensive measure and a deterrent than it really was a booby trap. Although probably somebody did fall down and die in that hole, at least at some point. But like that, rather than the Egyptians building traps for tomb robbers, which a trap can only be used once, right? You can't really build a trap that resets itself unless I'm mistaken. Any trap experts, please leave a comment in the comment section. But you can really only use a trap once, so you have to kind of be ingenious to sort of hide your tomb in the way that Seti did, where you have this massive dark abyss in front of you and you don't really know how far this hole goes. Or you have to hide your tomb in a strategic way, or you have to seal it off and encase it in a way that is so strenuous to actually break into the tomb that it's just not worth breaking into. And unfortunately, the sheer will of tomb robbers was almost never defeated. The tomb robbers won in almost every single scenario that I can think of. Almost every single ancient Egyptian pharaoh's tomb was pillaged, unless they were just never found by tomb robbers for one reason or another, or it was so inaccessible that tomb robbers couldn't actually go back into the tomb. So anyway, those are 5 very common misconceptions about ancient Egypt, and as I just went through these 5, I can think of another 10 to 15 more right off the top of my head, so I'll definitely have to be doing this again in the future. If you're coming on the Raiders Egypt tour later this year, I look forward to seeing you, and if you're interested in joining us on an Egypt tour in the future, well then I might have an announcement for you here in the near future. I'm Luke Caverns. Like and subscribe for more videos on the mystery and history of ancient civilizations, and I'll see you next time.